Hello and welcome to the podcast of the Prison Officers Association, the UK's largest professional union for prison, correctional and secure psychiatric workers with over 30,000 members. In this episode, we concentrate on the Youth Custodial Service, or YCS, and the particular challenges faced by POA members who work in that part of the HMPPS. When it comes to children and young adults who are incarcerated, the picture painted by official figures is stark. The ratio of boys and men to girls and women is over 50 to 1. More than 2/3 are serving sentences because of acts of violence, and the largest group by age is comprised of those in their 18th year, which accounts for almost a third of the entire population. Terry McCarthy is the member of the POA's National Executive Committee who has lead responsibility for the union's members who work in the YCS. What he has to report may surprise or even shock POA members who have only worked in the adult sector. I started off by asking Terry to set out what the YCS estate comprises of. You've got responsibility on behalf of the NEC and the union for YCS, but what actually do we mean when we talk about the YCS?
Within our remit in the HMPPS, they've got four main sites, which are Warrington, Wetherby, Cookenwood and Feltham, and they deal with young offenders between the ages of 15 and 18.
Right. And in terms of the big challenges facing the YCS, disproportionately, you've got people who are being incarcerated because of crimes of violence against the person. You've got people who are on the cusp of adulthood, 17, 18-year-olds, whatever. And that poses particular challenges, doesn't it?
Well, it does. The whole face of the YCS has changed in the last maybe 10 years. Gone are the days when you've got young lads who are getting incarcerated for stealing a car or shoplifting. Now, I think it's nearly 80% of people in the YCS are in for offences against the person, Section 18 and upwards, and up to and including attempted murder and murder.
So in terms of the agenda, the POA agenda, when you go in to talk to directors of these establishments, what's top of the list?
Well, again, are we dealing with children or are we dealing with criminals? Because that is the whole crux of the matter. The YCS has always been led by psychologists in the last couple of years. It's changed direction now. But the YCS has become increasingly more violent, and our members are at increased risk of serious injuries. Like we just mentioned, we're dealing with young lads now who, to them, violence is second nature. And we've got a cohort of young prison officers going in there without any protection at all. And they're under increased levels of scrutiny every day. So
what are the sort of things that prison officers, POA members, could do or do have access to in adult jails that just aren't available to colleagues who work on the YCS estate?
So for our colleagues who work in the YCS estate, they're not privileged enough to have rigid bar handcuffs. They don't carry batons and they don't carry parva spray.
That must make control and restraint really very challenging indeed.
Well, control and restraint doesn't exist within the YCS estate. It's called MMPR, which is minimising and managing physical restraint. It's just like a graduated CNR, if you will. So even when you're restraining a young person, it's got to be graduated in the levels of force that you're going to use against them. And don't forget, when levels of force, any sort of force is used in the YCS estate, it's heavily scrutinised, not just by the prison service and the MMPR coordinators, but by local authorities as well.
So is it fair to say that actually POA members working on the YCS estate face unique challenges that in many ways are more onerous than those that were working in adult jails?
Definitely. And they don't have the same protections that we have. I'll give you an example. When I first took over the YCS lead, I looked at some figures. There'd been 160 uses of force in Warrington alone in 1 month. And that's a huge amount. But when you factor in that there were only 55 prisoners in Warrington at that time, that's an amazing statistic. That's an example of the levels of violence and aggression that our members in the YCS face on a daily basis.
Is there any good news in this scenario?
The only good news is that we as a union now are heavily pushing towards parva, and it's been taken seriously by the executive directors of the YCS. And at ministerial level now, that's where the decision is going to be made. And we're hoping that the right decision will be made so we can at least afford our members some level of protection.
Is there a particular type of person or type of POA member that is well suited to, say, the youth custody estate, the youth custodial system, as opposed to the adult prisons?
Well, herein lies another problem. In their wisdom, the youth custody estate decided that they wanted to professionalise everybody who works in that estate, which we never, as a union, never had a problem with. It was a brilliant idea. But if you're unwilling to undertake that qualification, you had to find another place to work, i.e. you had to go and work in the male adult estate. When that happened 4 years ago, we lost a huge amount of experience in the YCS, with older officers, more experienced officers, leaving to find work somewhere else, even though they'd worked in that environment for the last 20 years. And you can speak to any prison officer. Older prison officers find it easy to deal with younger prisoners. Younger prison officers, without guidance from experienced older officers, struggle. It's a fact of life. It's the alpha male syndrome.
It sounds like when the employer took that decision 4 years ago, it was well intentioned, but actually the consequences hadn't been thought through. Has there been a kind of reconsideration by that management team that maybe actually they got it wrong in the implementation?
Yeah, there's been a recent recognition that we got that wrong, and they're now going to look at actively recruiting experienced officers into the YCS. But why, as an experienced officer, would you put yourself back into the environment that we've just described?
That's a $64 million question, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
So does that mean that the YCS is suffering in terms of staff shortages and retention issues in the same way as the rest of the prison estate?
Yeah, it's got huge retention problems, particularly in areas such as Cookham and Felton in the southeast of the country. Cookham is under immense pressure, as is Felton, because they just can't compete with the market forces that are there in the southeast. And why would you put yourself in an environment like Cookham or Felton when you can earn exactly the same money at Heathrow Airport, which is just down the road?
I mean, it's the environment for young prisoners in particular. On paper, there's a heavy emphasis on keeping skills up to date, rehabilitation, you might say. But does the level of violent incidents that we've been discussing on this podcast, does that make that sort of regime impossible or at best very difficult?
It makes the regime very difficult. The whole emphasis in the YCS is on education. Unfortunately, education seems to be the biggest flashpoint of the YCS as well. When you put different groups of young people into the education environment where they're going to mix up, going to pass each other in classrooms, that becomes a huge flashpoint. And there's been a lot of serious incidents in the last few months in education units in Felton and in Cookham.
There's some talk that actually the gang culture that exists outside prison gets imported into prison when a lot of these people get sentenced. Is that your experience? And if so, is there anything that can really be done about that?
That's not just particular to the YCS, that's the adult estate as well. Particularly in London, it's a postcode game. If you're from one postcode, you're in a different gang, and you're in trouble if someone from a different postcode is there.
So it's as kind of crude as that. Really.
It's crude as that. I mean, I think last I heard in Belmarsh, there was something like 84, 85 different gangs available. Obviously, Belmarsh is in the YCS, but what happens in the adult estate is pretty much mirrored in the YCS when it comes to the gang culture.
If young colleagues who are engaging at director level with YCS senior management, if you could have like almost a wish list of things that you would want them to fix, that they can fix and could fix if they chose to do so, what sort of things would be on it?
Firstly, a level of protection for our members, i.e. parva and incapacitant spray. We don't want battens in the YCS because, parva does the job just as well without really, really hurting somebody. Secondly, we would like to see actively recruit more experienced officers. And that's not saying young officers can't do it, but there's no balance at the minute. We need a balance of experience and young officers coming through. And thirdly, consequence as well. There's very little consequence for anybody in the YCS who commits a serious offence against a member of staff. That member of staff is just expected to carry on as per normal and deal with that same person every day, because there's hardly any movement between the 4 YCS jails.
I find that really surprising, because that would seem to be near the top of the pile in terms of tools that management have to maintain good order and a safe working environment. Why do you think that they're so resistant to doing that?
In the adult estate, that would be the norm, but it goes back to what we said at the start of the interview. Are they children or are they prisoners? The needs of the child are put first, and so they look at the needs for a steady, stable environment for a child. But are they really children when they're committing some heinous offences?
Terry, how long have you been involved in the YCS area of things?
So for the last 2 years, a motion was brought to conference by Cook and Wood asking for an NEC member who could dedicate themselves to the YCS. So I was chosen to do it. And to be honest, it's been a real eye-opener because my whole 30 years has been within the adult male estate. And when I started looking into the YCS, I thought, wow, this is a really unknown area of the prison service, so a lot of staff anyway. And when I looked at the levels of violence they're having to endure and not much support from management, it was really, really frightening. And I've tried to galvanise the YCS by having regular meetings between all four branches. They're now communicating independently without me of each other, because what was happening in the past was the management were playing people off. Well, Weatherby are doing this, Warrington are doing that. Now they're talking to each other, so they know exactly what they're doing. So they're all singing from the same hymn sheet. We're getting there gradually. Membership in the YCS has taken at a good level, and let's have it right. It's needed as well because of the level of scrutiny they're under, and there's always a huge amount of investigations and inquiries in the YCS, because don't forget, every incident of force is investigated and scrutinised thoroughly.
Yeah, but where you've got on average that stat you quoted me of 160 incidents for an establishment that's containing 55 people over a period of time, that level of scrutiny must be really onerous. You spend all your time justifying what you're doing.
Well, they have what's called MMPR coordinators who scrutinise every incident, and then anything that or they may think that's untoward, it gets referred to the local authority designated officer with responsibility for that area, and then they become involved. And sometimes you can't help get involved in use of force, but if you're involved in a certain amount of use of force and the local authority look at it, let's start looking at you and thinking, well, this fella is getting a bit too heavy-handed here, but you might not be able to get away from that. And that could affect your home life as well if you've got children. And let's start looking at you, because you're dealing with children ultimately, aren't you?
Although there are incidents where there is violence, is the violence of a lesser order, you might say, than in adult prisons? Or is there the same spread that you'd get whether it's adult or youth?
It's the same spread. But what's more prevalent in the YCS is gang assaults. It's not just one-on-one. There'll be 8 or 9 people will attack one other child within the YCS, and that's more prevalent than in the adult estate.
But if you have to deal with that group activity, it's tricky, isn't it?
It's very tricky, because by the time there's enough staff available or on scene to deal with the incidents, a lot of serious damage could have been done. If there's 8 people attacking one, you can't restrain 8 people at once, can you?
No. I imagine colleagues listening to this who, like yourself, Terry, may not have had any prior involvement or knowledge of YCS are going to be thinking, "Oh, that's a tough gig." What would you say to them if they had the opportunity to come back into the YCS?
If they were to come back into the YCS, and I seriously couldn't see why anybody would, after being afforded the protection they've got in the adult estate, I'd firstly want to make sure that I was afforded the same protection. And I'd like them to look at maybe consequences within the YCS, because at the minute there is none for anybody. And it goes back to the basic thing. We're dealing with children or prisoners. It's the age-old question. And, nobody wants to be overly heavy-handed within the YCS, but we've got to be realistic. We've got members leaving hand over fist here. We've got members leaving because they don't want to put themselves in that environment. And you've got to look at the people who are looking after in the YCS as well. We've got young kids coming out of their cells wearing 3 lots of tracksuit bottoms, 3 lots of tracksuit tops, because they don't want to get stabbed or slashed. That's the way of protecting themselves. Everybody, or a huge amount of people, particularly in a place like Cook and Wood and Felton, everybody's carrying a weapon. They've got to be searched every time they come out of a cell. So you can imagine how long everything takes.
I can only begin to imagine. Parva would clearly meet a long-standing union claim, demand. But to actually resolve these issues lies above the heads of the directors, doesn't it? It lies with government policy and factors in society that are much bigger and wider than the concerns that affect, say, just Cook and Wood or any of the other establishments.
Of course it does. Parva is, we need to look at the reasons why we need Parva, what works in the YCS. But there is no consequence for bad behaviour. You won't get your television taken off you in the YCS. It'll be very, very difficult because people will be scared to make a decision like that. You won't be moved in the YCS because They put the needs of the child first. They want them in a steady environment. So where do you go with that? It needs a whole sea change. See if we get the right answer at ministerial level with regards to PAVA, and we can move forward from there. It's a step in the right direction, isn't it?
My thanks to Terry. The need for a strong union presence in the YCS is the same as it is in the rest of the areas in which the POA organises, to protect members and give them a loud, clear voice. But the strength of that voice is dependent on the size of the membership. So if you haven't joined the POA, speak to your local rep today or visit poauk.org.uk, where you can find information about membership and all the work the union does on behalf of its members. Thank you for listening. I hope that you have enjoyed what you heard and will join us for the next episode of the POA podcast. Thank you and goodbye.